Hello! I'm filming a somewhat impromptu book review, which is something that I want to do more on my channel this year. I did ask you in my January TBR video which book review you wanted me to do this month, and I got a vote for pretty much every single book that I talked about. So there will be more book reviews coming because I do want to do those for you since you want to hear them. But for now, I finished The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle on Friday. I think it's now Sunday. And I have thoughts that I want to share with you. I'm going to start off with a brief synopsis, but this is a mystery book, so some people don't like to know anything going into a mystery, so if that's you, just tap ahead a very short amount of time. I won't be talking about the synopsis for very long at all. Essentially, this is set in a manor house called Blackheath, and there's quite a large cast of characters, as you would expect in a Agatha Christie style murder mystery novel. The character who has died is, as the title of the book suggests, Evelyn Hardcastle, and we follow a character who is inhabiting the bodies of different members of the house every day for 8 days, and they wake up on the first day with absolutely no memory of who they are, where they are, why they're there, what the purpose of them being there is, and they discover that there's been this murder and they need to figure out who did it, and it's only upon delivering the answer that they will be freed from this loop. If not, they'll start the 8 days from scratch again. Really, really interesting premise. That's what grabbed me. I don't read a lot of murder mystery anymore. I used to read Agatha Christie and that kind of thing when I was a lot younger, but it's just not really my cup of tea anymore. But the sci-fi elements to this really drew me in and I wanted to read it. And it was good. It is very intricate. It is very complex. I can't really talk too much about the plot in this review because, again, it's a mystery novel, so anything I say is potentially spoilery. But the reason I wanted to do a book review is that there are some things that go on in this book which I haven't seen spoken about, and I feel like I want to talk about them. So the main thing I actually wanted to address was the extreme fat phobia that happens in a section of this book. So one of our characters' hosts at one point is obese, and the way that person is described was incredibly uncomfortable to read. So I'm going to try and find you some examples. They won't be spoilery, but I think that they're just a good demonstration of what I'm talking about. So the first line in this new host is, "I awake, wheezing, crushed beneath the tremendous monument of my new host's stomach." Then later, "My silk pyjamas are soaked through with sweat and the odour rising from my body is so pungent it brings tears to my eyes." Shortly after, "The valet returns to find me mopping grease from my lips with a napkin, panting with the effort of eating. He must be disgusted. I am disgusted. I feel like a pig in a trough." Then the author goes on to explain how this host is so fat that he can't get himself up out of bed and get himself undressed and into the bath. And then there's a description of the host's body which reads, "Opening my eyes, I find myself reflected in a full-length mirror on the wall. I resemble some grotesque caricature of the human body, my skin jaundiced and swollen. Overcome by disgust and humiliation, I let out a sob." And I'm not going to go on. I think that that's a fairly useful depiction of this character, and it was just incredibly uncomfortable to read, and it's not something I've seen spoken about when referencing this book. The only things I ever hear about this book is how clever the storyline is, which it is, and how shocking the reveals are, which I also disagree with. The reveals felt sensible. I felt like I probably, if I were more of a mystery solver type person, if I read a lot of mysteries and I was really paying attention to trying to figure out the mystery, then I possibly could have solved it. But I'm just not accustomed to reading these kinds of books and trying to do that kind of thing, so I didn't guess any of the big reveals, which is fine. I did find them interesting, but I didn't find them hugely shocking. They weren't hugely surprising, not because I'd figured them out, but just because they didn't shock me. I don't know why. I don't know if there's any specific reason for that, but I thought that I would let you know. I do think that this book is worth reading. It is a very interesting premise, and I'm not sad that I read it, but I can't give it huge amounts of praise because of that particular section being incredibly uncomfortable. There is also a host later in the book who is elderly, and it's not quite as brutal, but there is some ageism there as well. It's just not quite as uncomfortable because the character that we're following isn't quite so critical of the age of that particular host. It's more of just a slight inconvenience because that host is a little bit slower on their feet because they're older and their joints hurt and all the kinds of things that happen as you get old. So it's definitely not as uncomfortable as the fatphobic sections, but they're still there, so bear that in mind too. I'm not trying to put anybody off reading this book. I know it sounds as though I am, but I don't know, I just felt like I really wanted to mention those things about this book because I've not seen anybody else talking about them, and so they really surprised me when I read the book because I was enjoying it, but though particularly the fatphobic sections, as I mentioned, which are actually quite close to the beginning of the book, were extremely uncomfortable to read, and I was surprised that I hadn't heard anybody mention that before. Although, to be fair, I haven't listened to a full book review of this one, and maybe if I had, I would have heard those things, but I tend not to watch full book reviews before reading a book, which potentially makes this video pointless because I suspect that nobody would watch a full book review of a book that they haven't read, especially if that book is a mystery book. But if you have read this, let me know what you thought of those scenes and those descriptions down below. I'm not saying don't read it if you haven't read it yet, but just be aware of it going in. It's still interesting, it's still very, very complex mystery with some very interesting elements that I don't want to talk about because of spoilers. I do think it's worth picking up. Those are just my views on some of the content, and I wanted to bring it to people's attention. So there we go. That's the 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton, also referred to in America as the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, which I think they just did that because it came out at around the same time as the 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which is a very weird coincidence. But anyway, those are my thoughts on that book, and let me know if you have read it or if it's on your TBR. And that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks, bye.